Okay. So I'm just going to share my screen really quick. Can folks see this? Maggie, you want to give me a thumbs up? Okay, perfect. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Ashley White. I'm a senior policy researcher at the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. For those who might not know, MTF is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization in Boston. We are most known for our analysis of sort of the fiscal conditions in Massachusetts around the state budget, stuff like that, but also have expanded into other areas like transportation, healthcare, early education and care, as we're here this morning for. And so we've typically done these sort of budget briefings every year for our members. We are a membership-backed organization. But wanted to kind of expand beyond just our membership base and expand just beyond sort of a general budget overview. And so this is the first time that we are doing this sort of policy specific budget briefing for folks that are sort of non-members to MTF. And really the purpose is, I think, one, to be a resource and be helpful to folks in the field. There's a lot going on in early education and care this year and last year. And we also want to be able to expand our reach, right? Expand our reach outside of our membership base to be able to kind of further support our research moving forward. And so we plan to do these briefings again throughout the budget process and are interested in your feedback and want to hear from you all too, if these are helpful and how can we improve. We're always looking to be better. So just keep in mind, this is the first time. I hope it goes well, but again, happy to hear your feedback. So I will dive in now to the agenda. So I think to start, we're just going to talk about the fiscal background, right? What is the context in which this budget is being proposed, right? What are the fiscal conditions sort of undergirding this budget? Then we're going to talk a bit about the gov's budget from like a high level, kind of what is the spending, the resources being used, tax package, all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to dive into sort of the early ed budget in specific, and then we're going to conclude with sort of what's next in this process and what you can expect from MTF moving forward. So in terms of the fiscal background, there are really kind of five things to know here. Tax revenue growth is flat halfway through this fiscal year, but that is on top of, I think as folks know, unprecedented tax relief, revenue growth over the past 2 years, right? So in FY 2022, growth through February was about 21%, and through FY 23, growth is basically essentially flat, right? And so some folks might say, oh, sort of this is caution, right? We should be careful. But it's important to note that this sort of flat growth is, again, over 2 years of sort of unprecedented tax relief growth, tax growth. And so we've got plenty of resources available for a strong budget. And you'll see that reflected in the proposal moving forward. Our approach to FY 2023 revenues was relatively conservative, which means that we are performing above benchmark right now. We're about almost $1 billion above where we thought we would be. And just as a refresher to folks, the consensus revenue process is when sort of the chairs of Ways and Means, the Secretary of Administration and Finance hold hearings with some really smart people from Department of Revenue, from MTF, from other organizations who kind of do analysis on where they think we are going to be in terms of tax collections over the next fiscal year. And the budget is really sort of built around some of those revenue assumptions. And so our approach to that in FY 2023, like I said, was relatively conservative, meaning that we're performing kind of above where we expected to be at this point in the year. Now, there is, I think, reason to believe that that number, that sort of 999 number could shrink in the next couple months. But I think just, again, important to know that we are performing pretty good. The fiscal conditions in Massachusetts are strong. We do expect that non-withholding collections are going to decline, so just something to kind of keep in mind. As folks know, the income surtax is now in effect, right? But in terms of FY 2023, the impact is really limited. We'll talk a bit more about that. And then lastly, tax relief obviously looms large over this session. Last session, there was a tax package that was proposed that did not get passed. And it becomes a priority this session again, and we'll see that reflected in the gov's budget proposal as well. So folks who have seen my presentations before have probably seen this slide, so I apologize for the redundancy, but I think it's really helpful in sort of contextualizing just how much tax revenue growth we've had over such a short period of time. So from FY 2010 to FY 2020, tax revenue growth was about 11 billion. In the 2 years between FY 2020 and FY 2022, we collected 11.5 billion. So we've essentially collected 2 years of tax revenue growth, 10 years of tax revenue growth in a period of 2 years, right? Just a crazy amount of revenues coming into the state. Some folks might say, well, it was the pandemic, right? And there was sort of a drop, and it's really just us coming back from those declines in revenues, but that's actually not the case. And so as you can see on this slide, FY 2020 revenues were essentially flat, right? So there wasn't this sort of big dip that we're kind of trying to claw our way back from, and that's why tax revenue growth has been so large, right? If we you could see that this yellow line here is if tax revenues had grown at the average rate prior to the pandemic, which is about 5.1%, and we are obviously well above that in most recent years. The stabilization fund, so for folks who might not know, this is basically like the state's emergency savings account, right? It is for us to be able to weather sort of economic downturns. And so capital gains collections above a certain threshold are automatically deposited into the stabilization fund. And so as you can see, as we've had sort of this growth in tax revenue collections, so has the stabilization fund balance, reaching sort of totally historic highs here. And so you see that in FY 2023, it's about 7 billion. It is projected to be above 8 billion in FY 2024. And then this slide is really just to kind of help, again, contextualize kind of where we are from a resources standpoint, right? I think there are some nuances in this number. So, it's not completely 100% accurate, but I think gives folks hopefully a good sense of where we are, sort of resources writ large, right? And so for those who might not know, reversions are basically, if let's say, give the example of early education and care, there's a line item, and at the end of the fiscal year, we don't spend everything that was appropriated to us. The department can then say to A&F, I want to be able to pack forward prior appropriation continued. I want to be able to transfer some of these funds into the next fiscal year and use them the following fiscal year. Any funds that don't get packed forward get reverted to the general fund. And so this graph is really about kind of reversions over a period of time, right? And I think this is basically just trying to articulate to folks that we're basically getting more appropriated dollars than we're able to spend, right, at the end of the fiscal year. Also wanted to give an ARPA update. This is also a repetitive slide, so apologies for 9:30 callers on here. But wanted to just give an update as to where we are. I think there's a lot of question about kind of federal relief dollars here. And so as folks may recall, the state received 5.3 billion in what they call fiscal recovery funds. These are flexible federal relief dollars that could have been used in a variety of different ways to address the public health emergency and sort of the impacts of the pandemic. And these funds are essentially all obligated, right? They're not necessarily all spent, but they're all obligated. And that is because in November, we took a pretty conservative approach to how we wanted to spend these dollars. So in the economic development bill, if folks recall, there have been conversations between the administration and the legislature about using surplus dollars for economic development versus using sort of these ARPA dollars. And the decision was made to use these ARPA dollars because there are strings attached, right? There's a timeline in which we need to spend these dollars or they get clawed back by the federal government. So it was essentially a smart choice to say, we should spend these dollars first and let's free up some surplus dollars. And so all of these are obligated. Now, will they all be spent? That is to be seen. And there's absolutely could be a chance that these dollars get kind of reappropriated if spending isn't on par with sort of those deadlines. But for now, they're basically not available for use. Then we've got so FY24 consensus revenue. This happened a couple months ago. And again, this is that process of trying to project what are we going to sort of take in for revenues and how do we sort of build a budget around that process. And so again, another kind of somewhat conservative approach here. We're assuming that tax revenue growth is going to be 1.6% over FY 2023 for a total estimate of about just over 40 billion. Then we've got income surtax revenues, right? Important to note here, though, that the consensus revenue agreement for this upcoming fiscal year did not include any revenue generated from the 4% income surtax. Why is that? Well, they didn't want to make a projection on something that they don't have a lot of information around, right? Because of how these tax filers file their taxes, we're not really going to have a clear picture for quite some time. And so it didn't really make sense to try to project as to what that would be and build that into the consensus revenue agreement. I will say, though, the DOR did estimate that those collections would come in between 1.4 and 1.7 billion. But again, we put this outside of the consensus revenue agreement. And instead, as MTF had recommended, the administration and legislative budget leaders basically said, we're going to agree to a $1 billion spending cap on surtax revenue in the FY 2024 budget. It's not going to be built into the consensus revenue agreement, but we are going to spend these dollars at $1 billion. And again, that is, gives us some wiggle room in terms of what they are projected to collect versus what we said we were going to spend. And again, we're not using any revenue generated by the income surtax in FY 2023. So this slide is sort of meant to articulate, I think, summarize basically, right? We've got historic levels in the rainy day fund, that stabilization fund. We also still have surplus tax, revenues from prior fiscal years that we've collected and haven't spent to the tune of 1.7 billion. And we've got close to $1 billion split between the SOA Trust Fund and the High Quality Early Education and Care Affordability Fund. The main message here is there are a lot of available resources for this FY 2024 budget, and we will see some of them being used coming up. So the bottom line, right, surging tax revenue collections, the passage of the largest tax increase in 2 decades, we've got ample resources to do a lot of different things, to provide meaningful tax relief, to deploy new resources, and follow through on statutory funding commitments, particularly around the SOA. So I want to now dive into just a high-level budget overview. And again, these handy-dandy 5 things to know slide. So Governor Healey's budget reflects a $986 million tax reform package that is proposed in companion legislation. So it's reflected in her budget, but filed sort of separately. And that has a net cost of $742 million in FY 2024. And we'll get into kind of why the difference is there in a couple slides. She's also proposing using income surtax revenue for major increases to childcare, education, and transportation. She's also including a mechanism to collect and track and manage those surtax revenues. And again, we'll get to that in a second. Workforce is also clearly a major funding priority for the administration with the proposal of this Mass Reconnect program, which would connect adults age 25 and up with cost-free community college. And then with the ending of the public health emergency, Mass Health is anticipated to drop significantly in FY 2024. You'll hear a lot of conversation about sort of redetermining folks on Mass Health, and that absolutely plays into that. So this slide is just meant to kind of, not going to spend a lot of time here, but basically we've got our revenue, we've got our spending. Our spending is less than our revenue. This is a balanced budget, right? That's kind of the message here. So feel free to peruse this on your own time. Revenue and resources. So I want to talk a bit about the tax package. So Governor Healey has sort of 5 major tax relief proposals. There are a few others here which are not included, but we wanted to really focus on, I think, the big ticket items here. And they're really about affordability in Massachusetts, trying to keep people in Massachusetts, keep families and businesses in Massachusetts to invest here, to live here. And so these sort of proposals hopefully get at some of that. So on the left here, we're really addressing some tax outliers. Massachusetts has one of the most expansive estate taxes in the nation at a $1 million threshold with a cliff effect. And so if you hit that $1 million threshold, you're taxed on the entire sum up to that and above that. Governor Healey proposes lifting that threshold to $3 million and then eliminating the cliff effect via a tax credit. So only estates above $3 million will be taxed on that difference. We also have one of the highest marginal tax rates in the nation. And so Governor Healey proposes reducing the short-term capital gains from 12% to 5%. And hopefully that provides, tax parity with other income tax rates. And then on the right-hand side, I think the biggest big ticket item here is the child independent tax credit, which Governor Healey talked about on her campaign and was definitely a campaign promise of hers. And she was proposing increasing that credit to $600 Currently, there are 2 different credits. I think the maximum credit amount is $240 per dependent, but there is a 2 dependent cap. And so if you have 4 children, you can only claim 2 of them basically with the credit. So she's increasing that per dependent credit amount, and then she's removing that dependent cap. So it's per child, per dependent in the household. The senior circuit breaker proposes doubling that tax credit. And then the rent deduction wants to increase that to $4,000 as the maximum deduction. So a little bit more on kind of the cost. And I talked about this earlier, that there's a lot of numbers, I think, being thrown around about how much the tax package costs. You see 986, you may see 859, kind of what gives, right? Well, the 986 is sort of the annualized cost of that kind of moving forward, right? The 859, the administration is saying that the cost of this tax package is going to be less in FY 2024 than in future years. And it's largely around the estate tax being less this year than in future years. And that has to do with, I believe, sort of timing of that tax package, of that tax change. And then you've also got this number of 742 million, right? The net to budget cost. That has to do with the sort of capital gains rate. And so, as I mentioned before, capital gains collections above a certain threshold get automatically deposited into the stabilization fund. And so when we cut the capital gains rate, we're not taking away from sort of the resources that are available to the budget. We're taking away resources that would be going into the stabilization fund. So the net to budget cost is actually less. So those are just explanation of some of those numbers. Hopefully that's helpful, as I think these numbers might get thrown around a bit moving forward. She also creates a education and transportation fund. This is about sort of being able to collect and track and kind of manage surtax revenue in a transparent way that is clear to taxpayers as to what's happening and where the money is going. And so in FY23, right, all revenue that's collected via that income surtax is going to go into this fund. We're not going to use it in FY23 in any way. In FY 2024, we've got that $1 billion spending cap on reoccurring costs, and then any collections that are above $1 billion will be available for one-time or capital expenditures. And you may see some of this language reflected in the budget, and we'll talk a little bit about sort of reoccurring costs versus one-time costs. And then in FY 2025, there is the proposal to kind of increase that cap by 3%. And again, anything above that cap is going to be for one-time or capital expenses, and that the balance of the fund needs to remain at 1/3 of the cap. Also, 2 things to note that are not on this slide is that they are proposing that the surtax revenues be exempt from off-budget transfers, so that capital gains to the stabilization fund, exempt from having to be doing those transfers, and then exempt from 62F, which was that obscure law that got triggered last year that returned billions of dollars to taxpayers in Massachusetts. I believe in her proposal is also sort of talking about what's ahead beyond FY 2025, that there must be kind of a process set up beyond that's more permanent than these first kind of few fiscal years. So perhaps those conversations will come up in the months ahead as to kind of how to treat this going forward. So where is income surtax revenue going in the budget? So again, we've got these operating investments versus these one-time investments. And you can see one-time investments are, there's more sort of going towards one-time investments than operating. And you'll see this reflected in some of the line item language. So for instance, I think if you go to the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership line item in the surtax section, it's going to say something about reoccurring costs, right? So you'll see sort of in the line item language them talk about provided for, reoccurring costs for XYZ. So a chunk of the money is going towards education, and a chunk is going towards transportation, a pretty close to 50-50 split. A very large portion is going towards higher education, and then some more money going towards early education, less so for K through 12. Some folks might be confused as to why this is. And I think back when sort of the Fair Share Amendment was being discussed, I think back in 2015, the real purpose of it was to sort of support K through 12 finance reform. And we've actually started that process in earnest, right? Before the surtax was even passed, right? We've established the Student Opportunity Act, and we are, on pace to kind of fully fund that. And Governor Healey's budget does do that. So her budget does fully fund the SOA. There's about a 10% or $600 million increase for K through 12. And so it is not as if K through 12 education is not getting the funding that it needs to kind of meet its statutory requirements and increase that investment. It's just not being used with surtax revenue. There are plenty of general fund resources being used for those purposes. And then, of course, you've got transportation in here as well. So just quickly on kind of spending themes, I think this slide is hopefully helpful kind of as to how, compared to last year, where are we in certain areas in terms of spending. And you'll see that the yellow is sort of all spending inclusive of the surtax, and the blue is no surtax, right? And so you can see we've seen increases in early education and then further increases with the use of the surtax revenue. So we'll get into kind of where those resources are specifically going. The two things I just want to highlight here are the kind of workforce and transportation, right? That it looks like there's cuts happening in workforce particularly, right? But actually what's going on is there's that economic development bill, right? There's that ARPA money that's floating around out there that needs to be spent. And so this is more so the administration recognizing that there are resources out there with strings attached that need to be spent, and we should prioritize those resources first. In terms of transportation, it looks like there's a sort of cut that's kind of being filled with some of the surtax revenue. But there's actually close to 300 million, about 266 million available that was made available in FY 2023, but is available over a period of years in a reserve for the MBTA to hire people. And so this is basically, the budget is basically accounting for the fact that there is already resources out there that the MBTA is able to spend over a period of years. So it's not a true cut. So now to the main event, the early education and care budget. Again, here's the sort of key things to know. The total investment here is 1.5 billion. The governor is using surtax revenues for key early education investments, for seeing it in C3 stabilization grants and the preschool partnership initiative, and in trying to reduce the income eligible wait list. The governor also proposes using resources from the high quality and affordability fund. I'm just going to reference it as the trust fund because that's a mouthful. Moving forward, and put some money for that towards C3 grants, and a new line item which is dedicated towards strategic planning and investment. And then, as I think folks are probably well aware at this point, the governor's budget also fully funds C3 for all of FY 2024 at 475 million. One thing in terms of the surtax, now, MTF and folks who work at MTF, we're not lawyers, right? We're not constitutional lawyers. We're not experts on this. But from a common stance standpoint, we think it makes sense to use surtax revenues on early education, right? Early education and care resides under the Secretary of Education. It's obviously a very high needs area, and we've got these resources available. We think it makes sense to spend these resources on early ed. But again, not a constitutional lawyer. We'll let them kind of hammer that out. But I think from our standpoint, it makes a lot of sense. So in terms of just the spending overview here, you can see quite the increase in the EEC budget over a pretty short period of time, right? So from FY 2019 to FY 2023, the EEC budget nearly doubled, right, in the span of a short number of years. You can see that it was pretty flat for a period of time, so we probably have had some catching up to do. Also important to note through this is as enacted, right? So this does not include any supplemental budgets or funds that were packed forward from prior years, or federal relief funds, right? And so, for instance, you see this dip in FY 2022. That is likely because there were federal relief funds available that we needed to spend down. But overall, you can see this budget is sort of building on prior investments and proposing to reach a historic number of 1.5 billion. The spending details here. So the governor, again, fully funds C3. And there's other sort of key increases in childcare resource and referral agencies and the preschool partnership initiative. You can also see that subsidies are close to 800 million, which is a huge increase over last year. You've got a $5 million increase to CCR&Rs. You've also got the doubling of the CPPI. And then you also have this rate increase, which is really interesting. I'm not sure that a governor has ever put a rate increase in their budget proposal. And so I think that's a great message that the administration is sending, and a great starting point for that line item. Two things I do want to just hit quickly here. The Department of Early Education and Care, right? It looks like, again, here's this situation where, hey, it looks like there's actually a cut going on. What's really happening there? So it looks like there's about a $610,000 difference from the prior year. Well, that's actually them sort of backing out of earmarks, right? So last year in FY 2023, there was about $610 million worth of earmarks in that line item. And so that is just the administration kind of backing out of some of those line items. And then with Head Start, again, it looks like there's a little bit of a cut there. I think it's also important to know kind of what resources are still available. So last time I pulled it, which was relatively recently, the grants to Head Start line item had about $8 million left with, a few months left in the fiscal year. And so that could be the administration just wanting us to sort of spend down the resources that are currently available before adding on new ones. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert on Head Start, so perhaps spending picks up in the second half of the year, but just wanted to provide that context that sometimes it's not what it actually seems, that there's other resources out there that need to be just spent first. So what exactly does the surtax revenues go towards and at what amount? And so we've got 140 million of surtax revenue being dedicated to early ed. 100 of it is going to stabilization grants. 15 of it is going to the Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative. So that's the doubling of that line item. So it's 15 as it was last year, and then additional 15 using surtax revenues. And then we've got 25 million of it going towards the income eligible waitlist remediation line item. We also have these funds from this trust fund, right? There was, I think, $490 million in this trust fund. The administration is proposing using 155 million, 150 of it for stabilization grants, and 5 million of it for that strategic planning and investment line item. So what do we have for subsidy investments? Just drilling a little bit farther down here. So the governor is proposing 774 million in subsidies, which is an $80 million increase over FY 2023. This is likely the annualization of reimbursement rate increases from last year. So if folks remember, there was I think it was $60 million of a rate increase in the FY 23 budget. And then the administration is sort of anticipating that, you also have the collective bargaining agreements with FCC networks. And so that's an additional 20 million. So the annualized cost of rate increases across centers and FCCs is 80 million. Then you've got this waitlist, sort of income eligible waitlist line item, which there's 25 million for. The administration is anticipating that's going to lead to 2,200 new families being served. I know that there's a lot of conversation about waitlist remediation and how effective that is and what that looks like and sort of challenges with doing that. But this is sort of what the administration is hoping that money will go towards, and reducing that waitlist a bit. So the total, as I said, is close to 800 million. And you can see in the graph, again, this is as enacted, right? Pre-level funding, quite the increase during the pandemic, and the governor proposes building on those increases even further. Wanted to just quickly reference enrollment over time. FY23 is an incomplete year, and so can't really that's why there's an asterisk there. But you can see in FY 2022, we served less children than we did in FY 2011, right? And I know that there's a big drop, right? During the pandemic, we were serving about 56,000 children, and then in FY 2021 went down to just above 45,000 children. But I think, as hopefully my subsidy piece, which I recently wrote a paper on the subsidy system and some of the challenges there highlight, I think there's more than just the pandemic going on here. And I know that the department is really working hard on streamlining some processes, changing regulations, making it easier for providers and CCR&Rs to connect families to care. And so hopefully with this these additional investments and those efforts ongoing, we'll see these numbers pick back up to pre-pandemic levels and hopefully above that. So wanted to just dive a little bit deeper on some of the other stuff going on. I know I mentioned some of this stuff already, but wanted to provide some additional context. So this additional money for CCR&Rs, it's about a $5 million increase over last year's budget. And I believe that is them annualizing a $5 million earmark in the EEC admin line item. So if folks may recall, there was a lot of earmarks in that line item, but there was one particular around sort of increasing navigation and outreach to families. And so I think this is the administration basically taking that earmark and annualizing it into the actual CCR&R line item. The language for CCR&R is about one sentence. It's really not any different than prior years. So we'll be curious to see what happens there. I do know that they are in the midst of, I think, redoing the procurement process for CCR&R, so we'll see how that work plays out. Then you've got the Community Commonwealth Preschool Partnership Initiative, which is doubling those resources. Those are really for planning and implementation activities related to expanding preschool. The language from this year to last is really not much different. And there's a preference for districts serving high needs students, and there's a preference for districts who have already completed their strategic planning efforts and now want to kind of move into the implementation stage. And I believe, folks can correct me if I'm wrong, that this program is sort of a continuation of a federal grant to kind of expand preschool. This is us sort of taking up the mantle on that. So great to see an increase there. You've got the waitlist remediation, which I've talked about. Again, I think there's a lot of conversation and debate about kind of the effectiveness of that, but we shall see. And then you've got this new strategic planning and investment line item for $5 million. I'll admit, when I first saw it, it felt very similar to a line item last year that was was sort of an infrastructure and policy reform line item. It was a line item that sort of is helping to fund the cost of care analysis for the EEC, for financial assistance for providers with children, for the regulation changes that we're seeing the EEC propose. And so I thought it was sort of a building off of that, which I think it does to a certain extent, but it's really kind of around the sort of financial mechanisms within the administration, within the department. So getting a better grasp on kind of supply and demand, making sure that we understand sort of what the additional funding sources are out there, and making sure that we have a sustainable financing structure, simplifying the way that providers do business with the EEC, right? Making it easier for providers to take subsidies, right? And then, coordinating subsidy eligibility with other state agencies, which I think is something that is on the EEC's radar, but clearly a priority for the administration as well. So we shall see kind of where this goes, but that I think is the sort of intentions behind this line item. I'm going to go into C3 a little bit, but wanted to just provide, I think, a spending update here in terms of the federal relief dollars, because I think this is helpful to see kind of why are we at the point in which we're at where the state is funding the program fully. So I think, as folks know, right, the majority of the program to date has been funded through federal relief dollars from ARPA, from CRSA, and so the timeline kind of goes as follows: that we received the biggest chunk from ARPA, which was sort of created the program at $314 million, and that over time we've really kind of supplemented that amount with other federal relief funds from CRSA and then from ARPA. Those were supplementary CCDF, Child Care Development Fund dollars that we supplemented that program with to keep it going. And then in November, we had that economic development bill, which really appropriated the remaining sort of federal relief dollars out there that could be used for C3, which was about 150 million. And so we've obviously been, I think, supporting the program with federal resource, but also state resources over time. But I just think important to note that we have really kind of exhausted those federal relief dollars at this point. And if the program is to continue, it needs to be fully funded by the state. We also have somewhat of a funding gap going on right now. The funding for the program, I think, is available through April. But there is a supplemental budget proposal that is proposing $68 million to kind of fill that funding gap to get the program through the year, where then hopefully the FY 2024 budget will pick it up. So this is kind of the distribution of stabilization grants in terms of the resources going into it. You've got general fund, surtax, and then money from the trust fund. I think important to note that I think, as I may have mentioned, there's sort of two sections in the budget, right? You'll see the sort of normal funding that you normally see in a budget, and then there's this new section for surtax revenues, which sort of repeats some line items, right? So you'll see the CPPI twice, for instance, right? You're going to see stabilization grants twice, for instance. And in the stabilization grants, in the surtax section for stabilization grants, the language really stipulates that surtax dollars must go towards grants for providers with at least 50% of subsidy children enrolled. And so I think that is sort of the administration trying to honor the kind of public education component of the surtax. I don't anticipate, based on conversations that I've had and how I've looked at it, that this is going to be an issue in terms of the funding lasting the whole fiscal year. It seems like this money could potentially go through the C3 formula. because a majority of providers who are receiving those funds are subsidy providers anyway. But just wanted to highlight that for folks. Wanted to also just give folks an update on like where have C3 grant funding gone? How have providers spent this money? Has it been useful? What's the data out there? And so EEC has been doing a really great job of surveying providers who are in the program to collect data on kind of where the money's going and how it's being spent. And so as you can see, majority of the funds are going towards operational expenses, which is really what the program was initially designed to do. And so a good chunk is for payroll and benefits. You've got other operational expenses. And then about a quarter of those funds are sort of in the new investment category, which is sort of salary and benefit increases, bonuses, and other investments like that. And then in addition to kind of collecting how providers are spending this money, they're also kind of asking a bunch of different questions about what have the C3 grant dollars allowed programs to do. And so you can see they've allowed programs to provide new benefits, to hire additional staff, to really maintain their enrollment, to increase staff salaries. You also see that if those funds were no longer available, providers are reporting that they would have to kind of better balance their budgets, right? And how would they do that? They would increase tuition, they would reduce educator compensation, perhaps reduce their staffing. Some are even reporting that they would have to close their program. And of the folks who said that they would have to close their program, there are 751 represented there. And I think about over 60% are subsidy providers, right? So this is really important to note who is really benefiting from these dollars and how much it's really helped, I think, stabilize the system, but make sure that our kind of supply of subsidy providers and subsidy seats at least maintains its capacity. So then wanted to just talk quickly what's next, right? What to kind of expect from the budget process. The next real major step is that the House Ways and Means Committee is going to release its budget proposal in early April. Then you've got the Senate Ways and Means will do the same. Hopefully the budget enters conference committee sometime in June, and the budget is signed by the governor in July. That is not always how it works out, but we cross our fingers. And MTF would really like to, I think, be a resource throughout this whole process. And so, as I mentioned at the top, we are looking to kind of do more of these presentations throughout those steps of the process and be a resource to folks. But that's kind of what's ahead in terms of the budget. So MTF research, I think, as folks know, we do a lot of budget analysis, right? I'm hopefully a resource to folks on that, a resource to folks on kind of early education legislation that kind of perhaps gets introduced. But we also do sort of longer term research papers. And so, for instance, right now I'm working on a piece regarding employer supported early education and care, hoping that gets published sometime in the spring. And then I really want to turn my focus in the fall to the childcare workforce, which I think is obviously going through a crisis right now and is a really important element of reforming and expanding the system. And if folks have thoughts or comments or questions or want to share and have conversations about this research, I'm always happy to have those conversations. That is it for my presentation. I know that was a lot of information. I hope it was helpful. Happy to take any questions or comments. I do see there's some stuff in the chat, but yeah. Okay. I see your hand raised. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, no, I don't know if I need to go first, but thank you. Ashley, this was a absolutely excellent presentation. Thank you so much for putting it together. And I really appreciate, and I think what really distinguishes this honestly from many of the early childhood education budget briefings that I've participated in the past was the effort that you placed up front in providing all the adequate context for early childhood education program operators and for advocates to understand these issues in the bigger picture. And while you kind of pivoted to the I don't forget how you phrased it, but effectively the featured part of it, which was the early childhood education budget, I think it's so important that we all recognize those features up front about where we are in terms of budgeting and why the progress that is being made is so important in light of some of these other features. And I do have a question, and so that was just to compliment you and MTF for the efforts that you're undertaking. The question that I wanted to ask, and I think you made this point in a different way, but in addition to the increases that we've seen over the last several years, which clearly are historic, and frankly, everybody on this call will be advocating for more than we've just seen, and we should. But I think a feature that I believe is important and should be underscored is it true that the state, as we move out of these federal stimulus supported budgets, is with each successive budget now relying increasingly on state revenue that can be anticipated to be more stable and recurring. And I guess maybe the question is are we evolving from what was largely increases predicated on one-time federal support to budgets that have now displaced those one-time federal dollars increasingly with recurring state revenues? And so we're not only making gains and seeing increases, but ones that are more likely to be sustainable because they're no longer reliant on those federal funds.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to just perhaps tap ourselves on the back for the fact that this C3 program in particular was fully funded at one point using federal resources, right? All federal relief dollars. And the effort on behalf of the state to, over a period of time, supplement those resources with state funds and now completely fully fund that program with state funds, I think is enormous, right? I mean, that is $475 million that, prior to the pandemic, we were not spending on early education and care, and this program did not exist. And so I think it's a real testament to this administration, to legislative leaders who have continued to kind of prioritize this program in early education and care, and making sure that we use the available state resources to kind of fill that gap and make sure that this program continues. And I think, to kind of build off your question in terms of sort of reoccurring and one-time kind of expenditures, I think the trust fund that I talked about, right, that's funded with sort of ongoing tax revenues, right? So although the kind of fund itself is one time and that there's kind of a sum of money that we need to spend from that trust fund, the revenues that are sort of in that trust fund are ongoing tax revenues, right? So that means that the administration, again, is prioritizing early education, building sort of the EEC budget into kind of these reoccurring tax revenues in a way that we hadn't seen previously. So I guess to wrap up, I think, yes, it's been an incredible investment on behalf of the state. And I think it is meaningful in that there are general fund ongoing tax revenues being dedicated to these increases, to these new programs.
Thank you.
There's stuff going on in the chat, and I want to make sure, Megan, have you been able to kind of monitor for me, or should I go back and?
Yes, no, I can
Okay.
pull out some questions that we've gotten through the chat. So we had a question from Tish regarding the rationale behind the $25 million for waitlist remediation, and if you're aware of any of some of the solutions that those funds would be supporting, or if that's still kind of a TBD question.
Yeah, so I think, waitlist remediation is something that has come up in the past. I think in the mid 2010s, I want to say, there was a concerted effort to try to remove people from the income eligible waitlist and provide sort of additional funding to do that. I think there are, so that's what the purpose of the $25 million is to kind of go towards subsidies to taking people off the waitlist. I think there's a couple challenges that we might see with this. One is, in conversations that I had with CCR&Rs and folks about the subsidy system, the main challenge didn't seem to be funding, right? Having the sort of voucher to get the child into a slot really wasn't the issue, right? They had more funding to do that. It was matching them with the sort of supply that is available in their area and knowing where that supply is. That's sort of the challenge, right? And so I think we might see some of that push-pull again, where it's not necessarily just a dollar thing. It is sort of a mismatch in the system of where people need care and where that supply actually is, and trying to kind of find that. So that's one thing I would say. And then I think also previously in talking with folks, waitlist remediation can be tough, right? Because that is the annualized cost of taking 2,200 children off the wait list. But as I think folks know who are close to the system, when you get that money, you don't take the kids off right in July, right? You have to assess eligibility, you have to find them care. This takes months and months and months. And so the sort of annualization of that cost is actually more than 25 million. And I think that kind of provides some challenges with maximizing those dollars, because the cost is going to be annualized in January, not in July, when the administration is sort of assuming that that money sort of starts to be spent. So I hope that provides some context there.
It did, thank you.
Any other questions in the chat, Megan? And I do see Mary Jo Meisner has her hand lifted, but maybe one more from the chat.
Sure, that sounds great. So we had another question regarding the work that you're going to be doing looking at employer-sponsored childcare. And Kim Davenport was just curious to see if it would include a look at any of the strategies, particularly some of the newer strategies that we've seen proposed by President Biden, including specific commitments for certain industries to commit to supporting childcare for employees.
Yeah, great question. Great question. And I saw that there was a New York Times article, I think, about that, and I tried to share that around with some folks. Really interesting to see, I think, the federal government kind of using their spending power to incentivize some good behaviors here. And to answer your question, I think simply yes. It won't necessarily be about the federal program, but the paper is, I think, going to provide hopefully a good overview for folks as to what are the options available for employers in Massachusetts or otherwise to provide benefits for their employees, childcare benefits for their employees. But it's also looking at other states. So folks may have heard of initiatives happening in Michigan called the Tri-Share program, where they're splitting the cost of care between the family, between the employer and the state. There's some other grant programs happening in Iowa, where they are sort of incentivizing businesses to build childcare or to pay for childcare via a sort of one-to-one matching grant program. And so the research is looking to kind of highlight those other innovative things that are happening across the nation, and hopefully help Massachusetts think about how it could potentially learn from those projects and bring that work to our state. Mary Jo, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ashley. Thank you so much for another excellent presentation. This is really terrific. I'm really interested in the other piece of research that you're teeing up, it looks like, for the fall. The whole issue of workforce is one that all of us are concerned about, but it's been a tough issue to get real significant kind of traction on and go forward strategies. So could you talk a little bit more about what you're going to look at in that research, and whether there is any other research that has preceded it that you're going to be building on?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think it does build quite nicely off of the subsidy research, in that a lot of what I think we have been saying is there are conversations happening at a high level at the legislature about reforming the childcare system, potentially expanding the childcare system. And while we have those conversations, we also need to think about the existing system and how that system works, right? If we want to expand childcare, we need to make sure that the system that we are going to build off of functions properly, functions efficiently, and that we can take that increased investment and implement it in a way that's effective in serving more families and children. And so I think the same can be said for the workforce, right? If we want to expand the childcare system, improve upon the childcare system, well, we need childcare workers to care for our children. And right now there's a crisis going on with childcare workers leaving the workforce for higher paying jobs with benefits and all those sorts of things. And so we need to kind of, at the same time that we're talking about reform and doing all those conversations, we need to kind of look under the hood ourselves and figure out how do we better support this childcare workforce to make sure that we can kind of absorb those additional investments, absorb that expansion into the system. And so this is sort of, we're in the beginning process, I think, of designing kind of what that research would look like. So would love people on this call, if you have thoughts or comments or want to share, I'm happy to have those conversations. But I think initially, you know, it's really about understanding kind of the existing programs that are out there, how they work. Do they work in conjunction with each other or not? How can we streamline them, improve them to make them better? What might additional investment look like, or should it go towards? So I think it's sort of taking stock of the current landscape in terms of our workforce in Massachusetts, in terms of the programs that we have to support childcare workers, and trying to put forth some recommendations on how we can improve those or further invest in those programs to better meet the needs of our educators.
That's terrific. Thank you. That could be a really crucial foundational piece for people to build on.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions in the chat, Megan?
Yes, we have another question from May Lynn. She's wondering what mechanisms are in place to ensure that some of the funding included by Governor Healey is distributed equitably.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. I think we've seen a majority of the investment go towards, I think, the subsidy system, which serves our lowest income families and children in the state. So I think that's one thing that she's prioritized, right? We've got 800 million going towards the subsidy system. You've also got this 470 million C3 program, which 65% of those funds go to the subsidy system, go to subsidy providers. And there is an equity kind of component of that formula to make sure that those dollars go to those who need it most and those families and providers who need it most. So I think those are the two things that I would highlight. And then I think the work around kind of surtax revenues and transparency around that perhaps plays into your question a little bit too, right? Making sure that we're being clear about how we're managing those funds, what those funds are going to. We're clear in terms of the language of what is surtax versus general fund resources versus trust fund resources. I think that all plays into making sure that there's a transparent sort of process to track those surtax revenues, ensure that they're going towards education and transportation as designed.
And we have one more question in the chat from Danubia, but she was wondering if you felt that some of the funding levels that we saw in Governor Healey's budget, particularly on subsidized programs, reflect any of the recommendations that you had included in your subsidy report.
Sorry, say that again. If the investments in the budget reflected my report in any way?
Yeah, the recommendations included in your report.
Sure. Yeah. I think so. I think there was obviously in the report we talk about C3, right? We talk about the importance of that program and fully funding that program and providing certainty to the field. And so we saw that in a more nuanced way. I think in conversations that I've had with folks, that kind of strategic planning initiative, a lot of that is about kind of the procurement of the system, right? Procuring sort of contracted providers and the like. And so that was a big part of our subsidy piece and making sure that the way that we do that procurement process is one, I think on a more regular basis, two, provides more flexibility to the agency to maximize those resources. And so I think a big priority for the administration seems to kind of be focused on that procurement process, which again was a big component of the paper. And the CCRNRs as well. I think I talked a lot about CCRNRs, and we saw a $5 million increase to CCRNRs, a sort of annualization of that earmark. And so I think hopefully that is also sort of an acknowledgement of the work we put into that subsidy piece and identifying that there are some resource constraints for CCRNRs, but there's also some other kind of operational issues that also need to be taken care of as well. And then I did see, I saw one comment about funding for future research. And so I just did want to address that. As I mentioned at the top, I think the purpose of this is to expand our reach, to be helpful to folks right outside of our membership base. But again, of course, to, I think, further our research, right? And so we have members, but we also get a fair amount of philanthropic dollars to support our research agenda. And so absolutely, if folks want to have discussions about kind of what our research agenda looks like and how they can be supportive of that, I would love to have a conversation, and feel free to reach out to me after this, because we have a lot that we want to do, and sometimes just not enough resources to be able to do it. Any other, Megan, or was that it? It was quite a few, so thank you, everyone.
Yeah, I think that covers the questions that we had in the chat.
Okay, perfect. And Tom, I see you raised your hand again.
Yeah, sorry to go twice, but thank you. I wanted to circle back on a portion of your presentation around reversions, because it wasn't central, but also I don't think unimportant. You mentioned that state reversions are increasing and it will be in excess of $700 million total. That's obviously not all early childhood education, but there has been a history of reversions
Sure.
the Department of Early Education and CARES budget.
Mhm.
And one thing that you had noted is, that the state sort of has more money than it can spend. But I think my observation would be, and this is very true for the Department of Early Education and CARES diversions, it's never been a function of having too many resources allocated. It's always been a function of spending controls.
Yep.
And I would maybe suggest that all of us, as we think about, our advocacy, sometimes it's about new dollars, but I think we also can continue to advocate for processes that actually will continue to make the best use of the dollars that are spent. And not just best use, but in some cases, like literally use of dollars that have been appropriated. And I think that there's just room for improvement there. So when you have, on average, tens of millions of dollars that are not being used every year as a result of spending control procedures, it strikes me that those procedures probably should be adjusted, and we should be thinking about advocacy opportunities around that. And with a new administration, there might be openness to taking that on.
Yeah, that's a great comment, and thanks so much for saying that, Tom. And happy to talk to folks offline a little bit more about what that spending control kind of process looks like. It was something that we did identify in our subsidy piece as being kind of a challenge for the agency. So if folks want to talk more about that, strategies around that, happy to talk offline. I will also say, on top of sort of the spending control thing, I think you also have this issue of, we lost seats during the pandemic. I think we've got some of them back, majority of them back, right? But it was hard. Again, it's not about sort of there being a voucher available that's funded. It is about being able to find a slot in the space that you are in, that you want to be in, right? And so I think that also plays a part in kind of not being able to spend down all our funds. Is, I have the money, but I don't have the slot, right? And I don't have the slot in the area that I need it to be. And so important to kind of keep that in mind as well. But thanks so much for that comment, Tom. Okay, I think we're at time, and I see folks kind of hopping off to go to other meetings. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments and your participation here. Appreciate it. Look forward to hopefully seeing you all again when House Ways and Means budget comes out in April. Bye-bye, everyone.